the summer of 1245, a Franciscan friar rode east. Europe was 2,000 miles behind him, his destination many more miles ahead. He carried letters from the Pope. The Holy Father hoped to dissuade the great Khan, leader of all the Mongols, from any further raids into Europe. He was even prepared to offer the gift of holy baptism into the Mother Church. In the Europe which Friar Carpini had left behind, prayers repeated constantly. The plea was always the same: deliverance from the Mongols. Only 4 years earlier, the Devil's Horsemen had annihilated both the European armies set against them. More than just a military disaster, the defeat was a shattering psychological trauma for which Europe was profoundly unprepared. The Church was the center of all learning, but even the best-informed cleric found the lands to the east a total mystery. The people were strange, fantastical creatures. Christian Europeans considered themselves an island of civilization and reason, set in a sea of monsters and myths. So when Europe encountered the Mongol hordes, the experience underscored their fear. Bizarre images of Eastern people filled medieval manuscripts and were accepted without criticism. There were headless beings with faces in their chests, and horned pygmies, Amazons, gold-digging ants, and even men with their feet pointing backwards. These legends were endorsed by the Church, the most important source of knowledge for medieval man. So while the Mongols had been building their empire in Asia, Europe saw only a cloud of myths. The only other part of the world Europeans knew anything about was the place they regarded as the center of the universe. For more than a century, Europe had been obsessed with Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the land where Christianity was born. The focus of Christian pilgrimage was Jerusalem. Although it had been under Islamic rule for 500 years, this was the Holy of Holies to both Christians and Muslims. So it became the focal point for 2 centuries of holy war, the Crusades. 150 years before the Mongol invasion of Europe, Pope Urban preached the First Crusade. Soldiers of Christ were promised a place in heaven. They set out to destroy the infidel and to regain this holy city for Christ. They faced the sophisticated world of Islam. It was a society no less driven by religious zeal. The Crusaders eventually stormed Jerusalem in 1099. Then, in God's name and in a self-righteous rage, they hunted down and slaughtered almost every non-Christian they could find. They behaved like any other invading army. Across the Holy Land, the Crusaders set up kingdoms and principalities. To defend them, they built formidable fortresses, like this one in northern Syria, Croc des Chevaliers, Castle of the Knights. It has been called the most perfect castle ever built. Muslims called it a bone in the throat of Islam. Crusaders called it the key to our lands. The Christian God's protection of the Crusaders did not last. Under the great Muslim leader Saladin, Islam won back its lands, and although Croc des Chevaliers held firm, Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187. Islamic supremacy returned 88 years after Christians had taken the holy city. News of the loss of Jerusalem horrified Europe. It was said that the true cross had been lost in the battle. The ailing pope allegedly died of shock. Europe was mourning. In its anguish and despair, Christendom turned to religious rumor and legend. A myth surrounded a mysterious and marvelous figure who held sway somewhere in the unknown lands of the Far East. If somehow he could be contacted and enlisted to help, perhaps he might be the salvation of Europe and her beleaguered armies in the Holy Land. Prester John, a priest king, ruler of all the East. Stories about him most likely came from ancient legends of the Magi, wise men of the East. As reports appeared in letters and chronicles describing this Christian king in the Orient, hope grew. Perhaps Jerusalem and the Holy Land could be retaken. Pictures were passed from church to church, each more imaginative than the last. Medieval maps often included an enthroned Prester John. Then the myth grew by rumors of distant events. The great Islamic cities of Samarkand and Bukhara had been reduced to rubble. Muslims were under attack by a mysterious foe who sprang from nowhere and then disappeared after destroying Islamic armies. Muslims were dying, so if someone was killing the infidel, it had to be Prester John. The myth went unquestioned, and Europe celebrated. Salvation was real. God had answered their prayers. But it was no priest king who had conquered the Muslims. It was Genghis Khan and his hordes. A Europe desperately clinging to fantasy was completely unprepared when 20 years later, the Mongol armies invaded and sacked Poland and Hungary. God himself seemed to have abandoned Christendom. This tragedy was beyond comprehension. The end of the world had come. For Christian Europe, if the Mongols were not the savior Prester John, then they were the Antichrist, the harbingers of Armageddon itself. The church claimed these devil horsemen were divine punishment for the sins of man, none other than the foul people of Gog and Magog, servants of Satan who would be let loose at the end of time. The medieval chronicler and monk Matthew Paris claimed that the Mongols ate their prisoners, and this was accepted as fact, though most Europeans had never actually set eyes on the Mongols.
We shall send these Tatars back to hell where they came from, or they will send us to heaven, which awaits the chosen.
But Armageddon was postponed. The Mongols left Europe after the death of their great Khan Ogadai. Europe feared for their return. So here at Lyon Cathedral, the new Pope, Innocent IV, called a council to seek a solution to the Mongol threat. The Pope wanted to discover the real intentions of the Mongols, who they were, and if possible to convert them to Christianity. So from this throne, he sent an envoy across the world to find and talk to the Mongol leaders. He chose a monk from the newly formed Franciscan order. So in the summer of 1245, John of Plano Carpini, a 65-year-old friar, set off for a destination which lay far beyond the limits of a familiar world. The Mongol hordes' storm from the east now continues. The monk and his few companions rode for month after month for thousands of miles. It was summer when he started, and he reached the Asiatic steppes by autumn. Then winter came, At times, food was simply gruel cooked in melted snow. For an elderly cleric, the journey was an astonishing feat of physical endurance. Carpini saw many strange and terrible things, including the skeletons of the recent Mongol victims. But he never came upon the fabled monsters he had expected to find. For days, they would travel without seeing anyone else. Then, Carpini encountered the first Mongol encampments. At first, they looked at him with some hostility, but when they learned that he was on his way to the Great Khan, they gave him an escort.
To tell of their good points first, the Tatars show considerable respect to each other and are very friendly together. They willingly share their food with each other, though there is little enough of it. The Tatars are quite different from other men, for they are broader between the eyes and across the cheekbones. They have a flat nose, their eyes are little, and the men hardly ever grow beards. They drink mare's milk in very great quantities. Their dwelling places are like tents and are made of sticks and covered with felt. Wherever they go, be it to war or anywhere else, they always take their dwellings with them. They have such a number of horses that I do not believe there are so many in all the rest of the world.
At first, Carpini was not able to make much of their religious beliefs. The truth was that they had very few. But he did notice that they always offered their idols the first milk of every mare.
It is impossible to put down in writing all their evil characteristics on account of the very great number of them. The Tatars' food consists of everything that can be eaten. They eat the filth which comes from mares when they bring forth foals. Nay, I have even seen them eating lice. They would say, "Why should I not eat them, since they eat the flesh of my son and drink his blood?" They are men who are dirty, in the way they take food and do other things. They make their hands dirty with the grease of the meat, and they wipe them on their leggings or the grass or some other such thing. They consider it a great sin if any food or drink is wasted in any way, and they give bones to dogs only when the marrow has been removed.
Karpini continued eastward toward the heart of the Mongol homeland to meet the great Khan himself and attempt to carry out his Christian mission. A year after he had set out from Lyon, he arrived at the imperial camp just outside the capital city. Again, he observed the Mongols' religious practices, determined to convert them to Christianity. He found that the Mongols practiced shamanism, based on worship of the elements, and centered around the divinations of the shamans, or clairvoyants. Their supreme god was heaven, Tengri, but they also worshipped the spirits of fire and water, the earth, the sun, the moon, mountains, and rivers. The shamans were powerful, and their chanting was full of significance for the conduct of daily life. But what amazed Karpini most was the Mongols' degree of religious tolerance. Shamanism had no doctrine or laws. It could be practiced alongside any other religion, and the Mongols actively encouraged the practice of other religions. Chinese Taoism, for instance, had been the first foreign religion the Mongols allowed to flourish. Muslims were also living and practicing freely among the Mongols. And Buddhism was another religion that must have intrigued Karpini. All these faiths maintained their religious and cultural identity under the Mongols. Mongol military ruthlessness coexisted with an almost total religious acceptance. But what really astonished Karpini was his discovery of a flourishing Christian community in Asia. These were Nestorians, or Eastern Christians. They had settled across Asia in the 5th century. Even today, they still worship in Aramaic, said to be the language spoken by Christ. Karpini had heard only of those Nestorians living near Jerusalem and Baghdad. He had no idea that they had spread so far east. As for the Mongols, they could not be converted. They incorporated aspects of any religion they thought had merit, a kind of celestial insurance. Karpini arrived at the imperial camp just in time to witness the enthronement of a new great Khan, Guyuk, a grandson of Genghis Khan.
The emperor of the Tatars has a remarkable power over everyone. No one dare stay anywhere except in the place he has assigned to them. Whatever command he gives, be it to battle, to life, or to death, they obey without a word.
Karpini was anxious to present the Pope's letters and to gauge the great Khan's reactions. But obviously, for the time being, the Khan had more important matters on hand. When eventually Karpini was led into his presence, The Great Khan's response was unambiguous. He sent a message back to the Pope.
The petition of your emissaries has been heard. You, who are the great Pope, come at once to serve me. You say I should become a trembling Christian. How do you know that you speak with God's sanctions? From the rising of the sun to its setting, all the lands have been made subject to me by God. If you do not observe my command, I shall know you as my enemy. Let this command be respected and feared.
This letter still resides in the Vatican. When Carpini returned to Europe with this message, the alarm bells rang. At that point, Europe was so disunited that Carpini had wisely refused to allow Mongol envoys to return with him.
Should they see how disputes and mutual warfare are the order of the day here, they will feel more inclined than ever to attack us.
The Pope had no intention of submitting to the Mongols. Disaster seemed imminent. But Guyuk Khan died before he could carry out his threat. And as soon as a new Khan was elected, Europe learned that the Mongols were on the march once again. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return. East now continues. In 1251, just 4 years after Carpini returned home, the Mongols reassembled their army. It was brought together under the command of yet another grandson of Genghis Khan, Mongol Khan. Genghis Khan had bequeathed to the Mongols a belief in their divine right to conquer the whole world. Any tribe or peoples which Genghis had not conquered himself would be left for his descendants to vanquish. So the warrior princes of Genghis's line continued to expand the Mongol Empire. Mongol Khan assigned command of the forthcoming campaign to his brother, Hulagu. Hulagu commanded 150,000 imperial soldiers and had 1,000 teams of Chinese engineers to build siege engines and flamethrowers. It was one of the largest armies the Mongols had ever put into the field. Hulagu's forces marched westward, but not to Europe. They marched instead to the most advanced and the richest civilizations still beyond their control, the Islamic Middle East. From Alamut near the Caspian Sea to the great cities of Baghdad, Aleppo, Damascus, and Jerusalem. Hulagu set out to destroy all Muslim power bases. His first target was northern Persia, 3,000 miles from Mongolia. This was the territory of the Assassins, a fanatical sect of Shia Islam and a formidable military force. They ruled from seemingly impenetrable fortresses in the mountains. The Assassins, it was said, coaxed new recruits with hashish-inspired visions. The word assassin comes from hashishin. With great ingenuity, the Mongols carried catapults and stone ammunition up the mountain slopes. Some of that ammunition still remains at the site. The assassins' power was destroyed. Orthodox Muslims everywhere rejoiced at the fall of the heretics. Their joy turned to horror as Hulagu's army marched on toward the very heart of Islam. The Mongols came down through the mountains and headed toward Baghdad, the greatest metropolis of Islam. Baghdad was the commercial, cultural, and spiritual center of the Muslim world, home of the Caliph, sacred figurehead of the majority of Sunni Muslims. It was the jewel in Islam's crown. Baghdad was one of the richest and most cultured cities the Mongols would ever capture. It was the workshop of the Muslim world, a treasure trove of science, art, commerce, and trade. The Caliph, unwisely, would neither prepare his defenses nor accept the Mongols' demand to submit. He sent his trumpeters out ahead and then declared that he had soldiers enough to dry up the waves of the sea, and he addressed Hulagu contemptuously as, "O young man, scarcely entered upon your career." Hulagu was not amused. Soon after, he captured the Caliph and forced him to submit on bended knees. Behind him, Baghdad lay destroyed. The sacking of Baghdad was conducted in classic Mongolian fashion. The enemy resisted. The onslaught was ruthless. The city was surrounded, the dikes broken, the walls bombarded for days. The city was overrun, and the population and those that couldn't escape were slaughtered. Great buildings were burned. 5 centuries of culture were destroyed. The stench of rotting flesh drove even the Mongols out of the city for a while. The Caliph was imprisoned and then put to death, supposedly shut in a tower surrounded by all his own treasures and left to starve. It is more likely that he was wrapped in a carpet and kicked to a pulp, a Mongol way of executing royalty. The Muslim world was devastated by the fall of Baghdad. Towns and villages all over Persia and Iraq submitted to the new Mongol rulers. Sultans, emirs, and atabegs paid homage to Hulagu, offering their riches and lands covering all of Mesopotamia. With Persia and Iraq conquered, the Mongols now headed towards Syria. Their thirst for conquest seemed unquenchable. Aleppo, 500 miles from Baghdad, was the home of the senior prince of the House of Saladin. Though bravely defended, the whole city fell to Hulagu's catapults after only 7 days. Hulagu ordered all lives spared, impressed for once by a garrison's bravery. After Aleppo, Damascus. Panic had always arrived ahead of the Mongolians. It always did. The city surrendered without a fight. A witness wrote,
"Since the birth of the Prophet, Islam has never had such sorrows to bear."
For the first time in its history, Islam was now without a religious leader, its resources plundered, almost all of its territory conquered. The world of Islam seemed on the brink of extinction. For Eastern Christians, it was a time of hopeful anticipation. They had lived under Muslim rule for 6 centuries. The Crusaders had failed to liberate them. Now, perhaps, the Mongols would. This was their fervent wish. Meanwhile, there were other witnesses. With every dawn, the Crusader knights looked out from the ramparts of Croix de Chevalier. Would the new day bring sight of the advancing Mongols? For months, they'd watched while the traditional enemy, Islam, crumbled around them. Now the Crusaders had no idea how to respond. They stocked the castle vaults and waited. Perhaps Jerusalem would be next along the inexorable route of the Mongols. Who knew? But it might once again be restored to the Christians. Across the Holy Land, the local Eastern Christians pressed for an alliance with the Mongols. They hoped that with Mongol help, they might regain the freedom and status so recently taken from them by Islam. But the Western Crusaders who had come from Europe were not so sure. A problem was that no one knew what the Mongols intended. Christian worship and prayer did not provide any clear solutions. In fact, Hulagu had no specific designs on Jerusalem. To him, there were other more important goals. He had already conquered most of the Middle East. He now set his sights on the last remaining bastion of Islamic power in the Middle East, Egypt. The Mongol hordes storm from the east will return. The east now continues. Egypt was controlled by the Mamluk Sultans, former Turkish slaves who had seized power in 1250, some 10 years before Hulagu's campaign. After Baghdad, Cairo was the most important capital in Islam. The Mamluks came to power because they were easily the most formidable warriors in the Middle East, and their ambitions matched their strength. The Mamluks were also empire builders, and their architectural legacy remains magnificent. As the last bastion of the Islam, there was much at stake in Egypt. Indeed, the Mamluk Sultan, Qutuz, had already declared his intentions of defeating the Mongols. Though the Mamluks were outnumbered, as soldiers they were equal to the Mongols, and they knew it. So they did not panic when envoys arrived from Hulagu carrying a familiar Mongol message.
We have already conquered a vast empire. It is for you to fly and for us to pursue. Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, and our hearts as hard as the mountains. Your walls, your fortresses will not detain us. We mean well by our warning. You are at present the only enemy against whom we must march.
But before the Mamelukes could react, the situation changed dramatically. Hulagu's brother, Mongke, the great Khan, died. The Mongol throne was vacant. A struggle for succession began. Hulagu's armies held themselves in check until the leadership problems in far-off Mongolia were resolved. Just as Ogadai Khan's death 20 years earlier had saved Christian Europe from conquest, now the death of Mongke would save what remained of Islam. Some of Hulagu's huge command were quartered in areas of good pasture, but most were spread across the desert of Syria. While he waited for news from home, Hulagu had no option but to withdraw much of his army to the better pastures of Persia. He left behind a small garrison force to hold his Syrian frontier against the Mamelukes. The vast area of Syria was now occupied by a mere 10,000 men. In Cairo, when news of the Mongol withdrawal reached the Mamluk Sultan, he ordered that Hulagu's envoys be executed and their severed heads displayed here at Cairo's city gates. Then he decided to venture north and attack the Mongols. In a passionate speech, he reminded his soldiers that the defense of Islam now rested upon them alone. He sent messengers north to Croc des Chevaliers and other Crusader strongholds, urging that they join forces against the Mongols in Syria, or at the very least, Crusaders should allow the Mamelukes safe passage past their castles. Cooperation with Islam posed a curious dilemma for the Christian knights. It was the most crucial decision they'd faced since setting foot in the Holy Land. With whom should they be allied? The Mamluks, their Muslim enemy, were fighting to survive. And if the Crusaders joined forces with the Mongols, they might, between them, eliminate Islam forever. But the Mongols were known to be treacherous. The memory of their invasion of Eastern Europe was still fresh. A victory for those savages would surely mean abject slavery for the Crusaders. In the end, the Crusaders chose the Mamluks, a group they knew better. They supplied the Mamluks with provisions and granted them safe passage through Christian territory. The Mamluks and a diminished Mongol force faced off at a place called Ain Jalut. The battle fought here in September 1260 was a turning point in history for the Mongols, the Muslims, and the Christians. The larger Mamluk army overran the Mongols. It was the first time the Devil's Horsemen had been stopped, defeated. Ain Jalut means Goliath's Spring. Legend says it was here that David slew his giant. It was also here that the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered for good. The spell the great Genghis Khan had cast upon the world was broken. The Mongols' ruined prestige lay in the ashes of Ain Jalut. Soon it would be the Crusaders' turn. Their decision to let their enemies fight it out proved disastrous, as history would show. "30 years after their victory at Ain Jalut, the Mamluks returned to remove the Christians. One by one, the Crusaders' castles fell. Croc des Chevaliers was one of the last to go. The victorious Mamluks engraved their exploits deep into the castle walls. The Crusader presence in the Middle East was brought to an end. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return.
There's a common thread in human history.
Hulagu's great army settled here in northern Persia. As a physical symbol of Mongol intentions, they built this stronghold called Takht-e-Suleiman. It was built around a deep blue lake, which the Mongols considered holy. But what was more significant was the great destroyers of walls had now become builders of walls. With the opportunities to expand their empire in the Middle East now restricted by the growing power of the Mamluks, the Mongols turned their minds to governing lands that had already been secured. This was one center of government. Elsewhere, Hulagu built treasure houses and observatories. He also commissioned churches and Buddhist temples. But unlike these remains at Takht-e-Suleiman, much has long gone to dust. From here, the Mongols began to rule over a land called the Ilkhanate. It was in a tragic state. The irrigation system, much of which was destroyed under Genghis Khan, needed rebuilding. Without it, the land would stay a desert. A huge construction program began, and soon the ancient waterways were working again. Water was brought back to the towns and villages under Mongol jurisdiction by the local Persian rulers. Many of the irrigation systems in use date back to those times. Farmers and herdsmen were encouraged to build up their flocks, and across the countryside, the land began to bear fruit again. Within just 2 generations, the Ilkhanate returned to prosperity. creating a legacy for which the Mongols rarely receive credit. But their greatest gift to this part of the world was an architectural creation, a tomb built for a Mongol Khan. This is the mausoleum of Oljetu at Sultaniye. When the Mongols built this in the early 14th century, they completely identified with their Persian subjects. They abandoned their shamans and their age-old tolerance to other religions and converted to Islam. They had, so to speak, gone native. The mausoleum is one of the greatest architectural wonders of the Islamic world. Its vaulting and dome were the largest and most complex of that time. They served as models for other buildings from Samarkand to Florence. By now, the local Khans had become Persian in all but name. Their courts, laws, and language were Persian, though their allegiance was still to the great Khan. The Mongol rulers here were never conquered or swept from power. They were simply absorbed into the rest of the population. In the bazaars and mosques of present-day Iran, you can still see the descendants of Hulagu's army. From Tabriz to Mashhad, from Tehran to Hormuz, the Mongol strain still exists after more than 700 years.
Learning Channel's special presentation of the Mongol hordes, A Storm from the East, will continue. Join us again tomorrow night at 9 Eastern.